Welcome to the Victims and Villains podcast, a podcast dedicated to educating and engaging listeners on mental health awareness through pop culture. And our lens for this episode, 351, is taking us through the inside true story of surviving the suicide of a sibling. This is the Bardwell Sisters. Please help chef turned mental health counselor, Miss Abigail Bardwell.
Hello.
So this is a bittersweet episode for us to kind of record together because we're recording it on the 4th anniversary of your sister's passing.
Mm-hmm.
And this episode almost kind of wasn't even on my radar. Originally, I talked about it in our chef episode that when we had connected over Instagram, of all things.
I know.
We just kind of exchanged phone numbers, and then that kind of ended up leading me to hear the story of kind of how you had kind of left the culinary art world behind to pursue a career in mental health, and kind of your sister being the linch point for that. And that's what we're kind of here to explore today.
I'm excited. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for Instagramming me.
Well, as you said in our chef episode, Abigail is going to be a voice that you guys are going to be hearing well into 2021. It's crazy how little we've known each other, but how many episodes we're already planning on doing together. Normally that doesn't happen. Just throwing that out behind the scenes stuff. It doesn't normally happen that way.
I love it though. I'm so excited.
So I guess for listeners that might not have caught the chef episode, the world of culinary arts that you were originally in out of college and the suicide of your sister, which we're going to talk about here on this episode, can you kind of talk about why you made the career change from food to mental health?
Yeah. So mental health has been a really big part of my life. Like, I really don't know how to say that in a way that doesn't sound like it's like undermining the actuality of it, but it's been a huge part of my life, whether it be, me being a consumer of mental health and mental health, like counseling and what have you, or whether it be, with my family or whether it be me working in it and having friends with it. So it's always just kind of been there. I let's see, I'm starting to kind of like tear up a little bit. I was in food for a very long time, and when my sister passed away, I went down a pretty dark hole. And I started using a lot of drugs. My own mental health kind of went away, and I put myself in treatment. So I was in treatment for a month, and in that month, I call it the month that saved my life, because I was supported by so many people who had been in similar situations and were on the other end of it, and I could finally, for once, see myself being on the other end of it and not being in it. So once I got out of treatment, I decided I was going to become a peer counselor. And to be a peer counselor, I'm not sure how it is in other states, but in Washington, you have to be a consumer of mental health resources. And so that put me in a really good place to kind of associate myself with other people who were on the other end of it. And then I started working at a place in Seattle called Fair Start. And Fair Start, it's a sort of like this perfect mix of mental health and food. It's a 16-week program where people who are in rehabilitation, in halfway houses and shelters, just getting out of prison, people with felonies can enter the program and come out of it with a trade, and Fair Start inserts them directly as graduates of the Fair Start program into restaurants. And so that was kind of my first shift into the realm of mental health. And then I decided I needed more. And so I became more and more specialized, and then finally just made the plunge a few years ago, and now that's where I'm at now.
I always tell people that have never lost anyone to suicide is while losing someone that you're either close with or have any affiliation with is incredibly hard.
Yeah.
Losing someone to suicide is drastically different than losing someone to, say, a heart attack or car accident, because
something you would expect in a way.
Yeah, and I mean, there are like unexpected deaths that are equally tragic, but suicide is kind of one of those things where it just like your mind's blown. I remember losing a friend of mine to suicide back when I was a teenager, and for me, like I couldn't process that.
It's very hard to process. You're right.
And so like I didn't initially kind of know how to go about it, but there's like that feeling that you're describing of wanting to do something more is like taking a match a match to firewood, basically.
Yeah.
And you're waiting for that pit to erupt.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, like I just started telling people, kind of trying to connect people with counselors and stuff like that. And I've done stuff like what we do now with Victims over the years. Victims is just a more evolved version of that. And so I'm grateful for stories like yours, because I think the thing about going through depression on your own is that it feels like you're going through it on your own and that no one else understands. And likewise, when you lose someone to suicide, it is sometimes very hard to find someone that understands what you're going through.
Yeah, I agree with that. Something that I've found being a peer counselor is, and I would be, when I first started, I worked in inpatient in an ENT center, so an evaluation and treatment center. And people would, there's this thing about peer counselors in mental health where they're kind of seen as like lesser than, because we're people who, one bad day, there's a saying in rehabilitation where it's like, but for the grace of God, there go I, it's like one bad day and anyone can be in that situation,
Yeah.
And so I remember I had a really poignant conversation with another person I worked with who had no experience in being a mental health consumer, a pretty neurotypical life. And one of the things he always asked me was, like, is my being here as someone who works also in counseling offensive to you? Like, do you think that we should be here? Like, a lot of people in my position think you shouldn't be here. And I honestly thought about that for a second. I was like, wow, I guess so many people do think of it like that. But anyone's experience is notable, and anyone's experience can help anyone else. Like something you learn today, I will not know. And anything you do today could teach me something. And I think that's something that's really important for mental health, is like with you and victims, you're doing something that's really important, even if you don't have the PhDs hanging on your wall that says you should be doing it, you should be doing it. And I always encourage people, if they have that in their heart, to do it, because, you can never have too many people helping with mental health.
I think too that there's a lot of stigma that comes with mental health as well. And so having very real conversations like this, whether it is looking at something like Batman and Robin, which we did on our previous episode, or looking towards something like Wonder Woman 84, which we're going to be doing in a future episode, the we're just having conversations about life, because we all go through life and we all go through these journeys, and there's tons of stories out there that are very similar to yours, Abigail. And I think that we need to kind of put those into perspective, because once we can start to place those into perspective and just have those real vulnerable talks about mental health, doesn't seem as scary or as intimidating. And I think what listeners are getting ready to hear in terms of Erin's story and kind of subsequently also yours, and is going to be this very heartbreaking, but I think at the same time very freeing story that people need to hear.
Yeah, I agree.
So I guess let's start at the beginning. And there is a 4-year age difference between you and Erin, and I'm wondering if you can just kind of talk about what life was like for you guys as kids. And just to be clear, I want to stop at like teenage years. So like just as like growing up as kids, like what was life like for you guys?
Well, all right. So Erin, she was born January 14th, 1985, and I was born July 14th, 1989. So we were exactly 4.5 years apart. And it was a really good age difference in my experience being a little sister, because like there's home videos where I'm just babbling, like just being a kid and just babbling, and Erin would look at my mom and be like, Abby wants water. And then like my mom gets me some water and I'm just like so gleeful, like, oh, thank God, like I have this person here to translate this baby babble for me. But she was always very very insightful and very, very much an empath, and could always kind of like see when people needed that translation. So that was just the very beginning of that, really. And growing up, we actually grew up in a very religious household, that kind of like went back and forth between, like crisis of faith, and then it would be, we're homeschooling with, with Jesus, basically. And so it would kind of like go back and forth between that, which made our childhood a little confusing. But we always had each other, like Erin was never, or at least to my knowledge, never officially diagnosed with Asperger's. I believe as a mental health professional, she did have Asperger's. I also have Asperger's. So that would make sense. And so there's always like home videos of like Thanksgiving and everyone's like playing football and, like interacting, and Erin and I are in the background, like with our face just deep in like books, like just nerding out. We were the nerdiest kids. And we were very into education. Erin was incredibly smart, and she graduated from a private school and just kind of like was jutted. I'm gonna stop at the teenage years, I promise. I'm just saying. It's like we were both just jutted into reality, and I think like our childhoods were especially kind of marked by that, of like a constant coming of age film, and I guess that's kind of where I'll leave it with our teenage years.
Well, we actually have to take a quick commercial break real quick, so we'll be right back after these messages. If you or someone you know is listening to this podcast right now and you're struggling with suicide, addiction, self-harm, or depression, we encourage you guys to please reach out. This is the heartbeat of why we do what we do. Suicide is currently the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, and as of this recording, there are 132 suicides that take place each and every day on American soil. And when you scale back internationally, there are 800,000 successful suicides. That is one death roughly every 40 seconds. So if you or someone you know is struggling, you guys can go to victimsandvillains.net/hope. That resource is going to be right in the description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this. There you'll find resources that include the National Suicide Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255. You can also text HELP to 741-741. We also have a plethora of other resources, including churches, getting connected with counselors, LGBT resources like the Trevor Project, and also veteran hotline as well. Please, if you hear nothing else in this show, understand that you listening to this right now, have value and worth. We get it. Suicide, depression, mental health, these are hard topics, and the stigma around them doesn't make it any easier. But please consider the resources right in the descriptions below, wherever you guys are listening, because once again, you have value and you have worth. So please stay with us. How would you guys like to help us get mental health resources into schools, conventions, and other events? Well, now you can. Simply go to patreon.com/victims and villains for as little as $1 a month. You guys can help us get mental health resources into current and upcoming generations, educate and break down stigma surrounding mental health, suicide, and depression. And you get exclusive content that you can't get anywhere else. And you guys can tell us which Nicolas Cage movie you want us to cover, and we'll do it. All it takes to get started is to go to patreon.com/victims and villains, or simply click the link in the episode description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this episode. Pick your tier and get started today. Yes, it's that simple. So quickly select the tier that you want and help us get hope into the hands of the depressed and the suicidal today. Welcome back to Victims and Villains. We are continuing on with the story of the Bardwell Sisters, and before we left for commercial break, we were kind of exploring your childhood, and it's interesting to hear you kind of talk about your childhood, because I think a large portion of what we've talked about over the last month, kind of shaping this episode, has always kind of been your teenage years and up until like your young adults. And when I say young adult, I mean like 18 and up. So but I think that it's interesting to hear you kind of talk about that. I also too was a nerd, so I'm right there with you. Everyone else wanted to do football and games, and I'm just like, but movies.
Yeah, right. Like, but I'm in the middle of a chapter, like, but I cannot.
Yeah. Now I try at least to connect with sports, and it doesn't quite happen. As you guys can see clearly by our catalog here, we've covered a handful of sports events and / movies. But I guess like coming into teenage years, and teenager years are interesting to look at from a mental health perspective, because you are going through puberty, and we teach kids 13 and up that they are going through these changes physically, but we never quite really talk about the mental and chemical change that their bodies are also going through as well at the same time. And it's kind of almost like this like shift, like once you hit 13 to like 14, like there's like your worldview seems a lot more like grimmer and bleak. I feel like almost like borderline apocalyptic. And I'm kind of wondering if you can kind of talk about some of the stuff with your sister, because you had shared the memorial video with me, and she had kind of talked about being in and out of mental hospitals throughout like her duration before being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And I'm wondering if you can just kind of talk on the teenage years and kind of how some of the more mental health stuff started to kind of affect your guys' relationship.
Yeah. I think, well, so first looking back, and we talked about this a little bit before we started recording, but looking back, it's really interesting because in adulthood, you look back on, if you know someone who's challenged with mental health stuff, and kind of looking back for those signs and signals, right? And there definitely were a lot with Erin. I feel like we were just kind of in such a space during my sister's childhood and my childhood, where my mom's dad passed away, um like right when we were kids, and her mom passed away right when we were kids. And like that was a really big struggle in our family, was my mom dealing with those deaths right when she had kids.
Mm.
And we kind of grew up a really, like I said before, in mental health. Like, even if we didn't know we were, like, we're my family. I'm very, very blessed to have a family where we're very open now and we talk about everything. But growing up, and you mentioned like going through all your hormone changes and everything, like we had no idea what was happening to us because our family did not prep us in the slightest. I'm pretty sure I didn't hear my dad say the word sex until I was like 25, like, honestly. And so we were, it was kind of like this confusing, weird time. And I feel like both my sister and I, we took all these feelings that we were having and we kind of turned them into shame feelings. Like, we didn't really openly talk about the changes that we were going through. And it was a very chaotic time as well, because that we were 4.5 years apart. She was right on the tail ends of her puberty, and I was just starting mine. So it was just like this bomb of estrogen went off in our house, in our home. But right when my sister was, on the cusp of, like 15, 16, that's when it started becoming very, very apparent that, it wasn't just cyclical, like, kid depression, quote unquote. Not that there is like a kid depression, but, it's like, oh, they're a teenager, they're mopey, they're moody, like, they'll get over it. It never happened. There was the getting over it never happened. And it got worse, and the shame feelings got worse. And, like, I looking back in my childhood, during when this was going on, I realized that I made myself so much smaller for the amount of chaos that was surmounting with my sister's mental health. And that's something that I still struggle with, is making myself smaller for other people. But we noticed it was getting really bad when, and I might have this story, I might have a few of them mixed up, but I'm pretty sure that my sister went away to spend the night with a friend, and the friend's mom made my mom aware that my sister was self-inflicting. And that's when that's when all of that was introduced to our household. Because before that, we kind of were like, oh, mental health stuff happens, but not to us. Like, that's not going to happen to us, where we're gonna be the ones, like, we're gonna be the ones who are fine. And then that didn't end up happening. But yeah, and I struggled with a lot of depression at that time as well. I also was self-harming at that time, but that didn't become out in the open until much, much, much later, when I felt safer telling people.
I feel like, too, you talk about the self-inflictions, and there's been stories that I've heard over the years of being in the mental health community about people that have, done heroin as a form of self-inflicting burns. But I think the probably the most predominant for our generation was just cutting yourself, taking a razor to the skin. And what I've heard from other people talk about, because I also too was a cutter. I was never really I never did it as much as my friends, but I did do it a few times in high school. And I feel like that is a manifestation of the mental state kind of coming out, and there's only so long before you can hide that. Eventually, those physical inflictions start to manifest, and it's harder to hide that stuff. And also with depression and some of the stuff that your sister eventually did get diagnosed with, is that eventually that body language is going to kind of give you away.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting what you said about the self-infliction, the self-harm, it coming in many forms. I actually just talked to my counselor about that the other day, because while I did start self-harming at this time, I my self-harm was very much a part of my life, but it ended up kind of evolving into other things. Like mine was more in the form of my eating disorder. I had a really, really horrible eating disorder where I was hospitalized at one point. But that was kind of my way of self-harming. And I feel like with there's kind of like the coin of like, oh, our generation being like the cutters and like so emotional and whatever. I feel like testing those negative feelings on yourself is a very, very common and almost normal thing of the psyche. You're testing your mortality, you're testing how far the boundaries go, how badly am I feeling bad about myself, how deep does it really go. And I think it's really normal for kids to test that, and you can see it in different ways. Some people like us self-harm in the more quote unquote normative ways that you would expect. Some kids are the kind of kids who run in front of cars, and honestly, if you think about it and break it down, that also is a way of testing yourself and being here, really.
Yeah, we kind of touched about it in our In the Mouth of Madness episode, questioning really what is reality. And I think to a certain extent, cutting yourself or other forms of self-infliction, they definitely test that theory of what is my purpose. And you kind of almost go through this identity crisis at some points going through those self-inflictions. And I know that you touched about it, obviously, and then we're talking about your sister too, is that you guys were both self-inflicting. And I know that you had talked about the age difference and kind of like she's getting out of puberty as you're coming into it. Remember wondering if there was like ever any kind of support there that she went through what you were going through with the self-infliction, and kind of like, did you guys ever kind of overlap at any point?
We did. We actually our lives became very separate very quickly, as my sister kind of like went further down into her rabbit hole of like mental illness and depression. And I, like, she didn't really want anyone there with her. Again, like those feelings of shame, because I feel like, it's pretty typical and normal to be in a family that has a history of mental health issues and challenges. And then as you're growing up, like I said earlier, it's like, well, that's not going to be me, like it's going to be different. And as you get older and you start feeling those feelings and feeling that like, oh, like the way I'm feeling isn't how a lot of people are feeling. And then you just kind of realize, like, oh, it's me too. Definitely, we tried to hide that, and we ended up hiding it from each other, actually. And as we talked about it when we were adults, we actually hid it from each other because we didn't want to bring that into the other one's life. Because what if the other one was the one, who was gonna be normal and unaffected? Like, and honestly, it came from, like, when I think about it, it kind of brings tears to my eyes because it came from such a pure place between both of us of like, oh, I'm feeling these really, really negative, bad feelings, but I don't want her to think that she did it, or like that she has anything to do with it, like that she's involved in this in any way. And a lot of our mental health challenges as we got older did overlap. My sister also struggled with an eating disorder. And I actually was just diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And so it's this weird this weird thing of like, you know, we were separate for a very long time because, you know, like you said, my sister was going in and out of hospitals and on different medications. And so, you know, like I would kind of lose her for a little bit and then she'd come back. But we always kind of met back with each other with like oh, so how's your mental health doing? Because we always had that, and we would always kind of like, you know, share that over tea and cookies in a way.
And you talked about the culture of shame that comes with mental health, and I feel like what I'm about to say is definitely going to age us, but we grew up in the era of MySpace and Facebook.
Live journal here. I was a live journal.
Yeah. I was also on Zynga, so there's that.
Yeah. Yep, Zynga, so pure.
Nostalgia.
Yeah.
But it's like those early indications really were kind of like the blueprint of this culture of shame, that if you didn't look a certain way, wear certain styles of clothing, or listen to certain styles of music, then you were shamed almost. And you know, cyberbullying was kind of coming really into effect. And so I think that a large portion of stuff that we're growing up against with social media and stuff that falls under that umbrella really starts to implement those feelings of shame.
Yeah.
It really starts to kind of, you know, say, okay, well, I don't look like this. And the fact that, you know, all my friends are posting all of these positive, you know, pictures and statements like, this is not what I'm going through. Like, I am feeling the urge right now that I don't want to be alive. And how do I communicate that to a generation that's growing up on just this really positive outlook on life? And then you come to find out that a lot of other people really aren't like that. That they project these self-images that make their lives seem grander than they actually are. And I think that kind of also impacted us growing up, talking about it, because I remember, for me, going through my phase of depression and really wanting to kill myself. Like, it took me like really 6 months of just like distancing myself and like really figuring stuff out before like I could actually kind of come to grips with the fact that like I was cutting myself, that I didn't want to be alive anymore, that I felt hopeless. Mm-hmm. And I think a large portion of that kind of comes from the internet world, or throwback to this as well, the second life that we create online, that it differs from our own reality.
Yeah.
And you know, so it's interesting. 4.5 years doesn't seem like a large gap of time, but there are certain things that we experienced as teenagers that your sister didn't go through.
Yeah, and you make a really good point with like social media. It's kind of a blessing and a curse with mental health, because I feel like a big reason that things have progressed so quickly in mental health land, you know, is because of social media. You know, like we are able to say more than we would be able to in person with people who we wouldn't be able to say things to in person normally. And so, you know, like I kind of catch a lot of shit for it, because I'm a person who has no filter and will post anything that I'm feeling, and I feel like I shouldn't be shamed for that because they're my feelings. And so a lot of it can be kind of depressing, honestly. Like a lot of it's kind of sad, but you know what, I'm sad. And I the stigma, like you said earlier, the stigma of feeling sad, like it holds so many people back. And this feeling of depression, do I want to live? Why am I living? What is reality? what would it be like if I wasn't here? Would things be here if I wasn't here? You know, like those questions are not only healthy, but they're normal. And I wish that it was more normalized that, you know, like today I'm really feeling like I don't want to exist. Can you help me? I feel like a lot of things would be better if that was okay to say. It's definitely getting there. I see so much progress, and again, like our generation's caught so much shit for, you know, being so sad and what have you, but there's leaps and bounds of a difference between how things are now in the mental health community and how they were, you know, 20 years ago.
Absolutely. Even 5 years ago, we're starting to really make these strides and these differences to where people are more apt to respond to someone on suicide or even someone like depression. Like I've seen quite a few Facebook posts this week just like saying like, hey, like this is the suicide lifeline. Will someone share this? Yeah. And I feel like this time last year, like I really wasn't seeing it. And so it's really cool to kind of see that growth, even from 2016 when we started doing suicide prevention and mental health awareness, how far it's come, as far as like people like being willing to kind of open up about it. And with opening up, there's like this release of freedom that kind of comes to it. Like you feel like this weight off your chest to where like you don't have to feel ashamed for being sad, or you don't have to, you know, be ashamed of, you know, feeling depression, because it's biologically normal. And everyone, I think, feels a degree of depression, whether you're diagnosed clinically with it to a severe case, or even something like I have days where I just go through really, really sad emotions. Depression kind of is like this broad span that I think sometimes we don't take into consideration. But when you start to open up and talk about it, there's this freedom and this breath of fresh air that comes with it. And I'm wondering, can you talk about how it was like the first time that you and your sister started to kind of talk about your mental health struggles with one another? Like, kind of like, how did that affect your relationship?
So it started happening when she was she started college, and we would talk, again, aging myself, we would talk over AOL Instant Messenger. Yes. But I feel like us being able to talk over, may I say, AIM, AOL Instant Messenger, it again provided that like necessary level of, obviously not anonymity, but of like dissonance, where, you know, I could say, hey, Erin, I also struggle with that. You know, like I see you, I'm giving you visibility right now in a way that we weren't honestly comfortable with in person. And we were never really comfortable with it in person. Like our family, we're not like the touchy-feely, huggy family at all. And then on top of that, you know, like my sister and I were, you know, 200 pounds together soaking wet, and just like this weird conglomeration of like arms and legs and like little stick figures. And we were just awkward, man. Like we're just so awkward. And we, like, us in person, we were just always like talking over each other. Like it was just weird. But on AOL Instant Messenger, we could actually talk. And so that's when it started coming out. The eating disorder part, I feel like that's when we started really giving each other visibility, because when I was hospitalized, it's one of those things where, put a pin in this. It's one of those things where I feel like you say, oh, I have an eating disorder, and people are like, why? You're so thin, you know, like you're so pretty. Why do you have one? It's like, no, I hate myself. Like that's, I'm not doing it because of anything like that. And there's this, you know, like if you say like, oh, I'm depressed, and people are just like, oh, well, go outside, you know, like go take a walk. That's it doesn't help some people, you know, like it doesn't.
I mean, I hear it from a different kind of group of people, where my wife and I, we are very much, you know, we're Christians. And when we tell people that like some of our most active prayers are like praying for people with depression and suicide. It's like, well, if you really had these things, then you just have to pray harder. Clearly you're not praying enough. And it's like, well, no, that's not actually how those things like work. I mean, sometimes it does, but not all the times.
It's actually interesting you say that, because that was one of the big barriers for my sister. And our 4.5 years, one of those things that it included was kind of the shifting of our family's faith. And I myself, I would identify as a very spiritual person. I never was really emotionally attached to religion. My sister very much was. And so her crisis of faith really affected her. And when she started coming out to people about her mental health struggles, and she was like, I just don't want to be here anymore, the response was just kind of like, oh, of course you do. Like, Jesus wants you here. And it made her feel bad, because it's like, oh, well, if Jesus wants me here and I don't want to be here, then I'm bad. And it's just kind of like, it's one of those things where we, in hindsight, we wish that we had brought her to a more secular group of people first, because it just kind of like turned into a barrier with her, and it caused a huge shame spiral. But yeah, that's another thing to always take into consideration too, is like how people's faith is handling mental health issues.
And I just want to like take an aside real quick to not only you, but like also some of the listeners, and kind of talking about, I think that we sometimes get so wrapped up in the politics of faith and believing in the church and stuff like that, that we oftentimes fail to see people as people. And we're really quick to just kind of put this Band-Aid on it and say, oh, just pray it out, it'll be fine. It's like, well, no, like I need like actual like communication, like actual connection, like that's what I think is going to make me feel better as a person. And I just want to apologize on behalf of all Christians right now, kind of giving quote unquote Christians a bad name, just for kind of band-aiding that stuff, because that has been one of the things that I've really have kind of had to grind my teeth about, having conversations with certain people, because also being a Christian is kind of like, it's weird to kind of like see how people interpret mental health, and see how much faith can actually make or break someone's mental health journey.
Yeah, I mean, I am now 31, and I've spent the past few years, my fiance is a Christian. I've spent the past few years really accepting and acknowledging and validating and giving visibility to the human experience, however it may be. I'm taking a class right now that is so profound, on positive psychology. And one of the things that it really touches on and really hammers in is mental, instead of saying that, like really identifying mental health as these series and separations of diagnoses, really acknowledging it as just a variation of the human experience. Like we're all here, we're all going through it. Like the way some person is handling it or going through it should not equal less or more than the next person's. And really that people first language, like, I'm not a borderline, I am a person with borderline personality disorder. And I think if we just all kind of like took that moment to just be like, oh, like I'm being so bipolar today. No. No. Like really kind of just really giving meaning and actuality to what we're saying and our intentions.
And I guess I want to talk about, the importance of communication, and kind of how admitting something that you, whether it is depression or you have these feelings of suicide, or you're coming to grips with an addiction, or just anything that really is self-inflicting, it is has this tendency to really affect the relationships around you.
Yeah.
And so you talked about the crisis of faith that Erin started to experience around the time of really diving into kind of, I would dare say, like mental health, kind of derailing almost a little bit from the sounds of it. And I'm wondering if I keep saying that. Can you talk about the? Let me back up. Let me edit that 5.
I do that all the time.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna edit this and I'm gonna count down as a 5, 4, 3. How did how did her crisis of faith and subsequent, like, the identity shift in who she was now start to affect the relationships and the family dynamic for you guys?
It was interesting. It was a big process. My sister was kind of the first one to out herself as, like having a crisis of faith. My mom especially took it really hard. My mom, I think, like we all definitely had crises of faith. But my mom's was really, really hard because of the mental health and the mental illness. And that those shame feelings, it's like, am I not a good enough Christian because now my daughter is suffering? And I feel like she still kind of goes through that, and I really feel for her for that. Mine, I kind of had it easier because, my sister was kind of like, creating the distraction when I had the getaway car. Like my sister had all this stuff going on, and I was just kind of like, weaseling around in the background. But also at the same time, like I said earlier, that made me really minimize myself and have a lot of self-loathing feelings of, well, do I need to have a huge mental health crisis to get love? And it all just, man, like it all just kind of ping-ponged off of each other. I feel like our lack of communication was a really detrimental part of what made it way worse than it had. I feel weird saying that, but way worse than it had to be. I feel like if we had more of an openness and honesty again about that human experience and really validating and giving visibility to each other, we might have been in a different place. But going on communication and kind of touching back on the social media, now social media is really kind of our main method of communication, and something that I also want to, kind of outline for our listeners out there is not to downplay social media. Like if someone is reaching out on social media and someone says, I don't feel like being here anymore, and it's on Facebook, give that life, because my sister was one of the people who posted her goodbye message on social media, and a lot of people are just like, oh no, like it'll be okay, this has happened before, if she really needed help she would have called me. And that's one of my struggles, because I did see that message and that was my thought, and so I take that lesson and I hope to pass it on.
There are definitely some people that use social media as kind of a way to just communicate, and just to be perfectly blunt, that sometimes mental health struggles feel like you're screaming and no one's hearing you.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're going to put it out there where you know that you have some people that are going to see it, whether that is Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or a number of these other platforms that are available now. And, like I said, like social media is definitely a blessing and a curse for mental health. Mm-hmm. And I can definitely say that I was around a lot of friends when I was younger that always talked about killing themselves. And I was always the one that would be like, shoot me a message, give me a call anytime, because you never know. Like, honestly, and it's heartbreaking to hear that Erin posted something like that on social media, and just no one kind of took it seriously. And so you kind of have this survivor's guilt that is created to say, if I would have dared to just shoot her a message or to pick up the phone, like, would she still be here?
I do want to say a lot of people did take it seriously. I'm just talking about my personal perspective of it.
Sure.
At the same time, though, and this is gonna sound bad, but there have been so many attempts previously that I feel like, myself included, so many of the people around her were kind of in the safe space of, oh, she'll be fine. And I feel like that kind of happens a lot with people, especially on social media, where it's like, oh, like they'll be fine. Like if they had the chutzpah to kind of go on Facebook and post a status about it, then they're fine. And I have this conversation with a lot of my friends where it's like, what is fine? And it's kind of going back to the questioning of reality of, what is fine? Like what is an acceptable amount of depression to feel before someone takes it seriously enough to acknowledge it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like in some ways we're kind of getting ahead of the story.
Yes, that's true.
It happens sometimes when we do these episodes, especially when you are talking with someone that is just a great conversationalist, and passionate about mental health. And so coming back into perspective with your sister's story, I wanted to kind of ask, like, what happened once she kind of turned 18. How did things kind of differ? When did she like move out and start to like, how did that start to like her being separated from a traditional family environment? How did that affect her mental health?
Well, first of all, LOL, traditional. Like, sure, Josh. But no, but I when she first moved out, I think that's when it started getting into a really dark spot, because yeah, she was experiencing depression and having her borderline symptoms, and really going through it. She was first diagnosed with bipolar, as most people with borderline personality disorder are. But she had my parents to make sure that she was eating, she was taking showers, hygiene, going to her appointments. It's really jarring to have that support and then leave. And I'm saying this is someone who also experienced that, to leave and just realize like, oh wow, I could literally sit here in the dark for 7 days straight and no one would do anything about it. Like it's kind of like exploring that autonomy, but in a really dark place. And my sister's first attempt happened her first semester, or her first year of college. And growing up how we did, we were not really exposed to a lot of our friends drinking or using drugs or what have you. And so kind of being thrown into that, where it's like, oh, like there's alcohol in the dorms, and like I can use this to self-medicate. That's I feel like, using your word derailed, I feel like that is kind of where it derailed for her.
And one thing that I think listeners kind of might not be aware of is we really preface the amount of successful suicides that take place in our country on this show. And there is 130, as of this recording, there are 132 that take place daily. And for every one of those suicides, there are 25 more that are attempted. Mm-hmm. And so that just kind of brings it a little bit deeper into perspective, that just because you're seeing, oh, that's, one suicide's too much, but, 100, over 100 taking place daily, those are just the ones that are actually just from start to finish, you know, are completed, for lack of a better word. And then you putting into perspective that there are 25 more suicides for every one that is successful. And your sister around this time too also had attempted suicide several times, and whether or not, you know, it is in the traditional sense where it is, you know, you are just going to do something really quick, like you know, the a noose or a gun or a weapon. You know, in some ways there are equally slower suicides that at least I would consider them suicides. If you're like, especially if you're not in the right state with drug use, is a great example of that, is that you are basically gambling on your life at that point. If you're heavily drinking, blacking out, you know, you're gambling on your life, whether or not you're going to wake up from alcohol poisoning or not. And I'm wondering kind of like how that environment started to shape her mental health, being around those implements of destruction, for lack of a better word.
Well, I can speak from my own experience. You're very, very much correct. And I wish I could scream this from the fucking rooftops, is, you know, especially with us and our eating disorder. Eating disorders are the number one most dangerous, most fatal mental health issue that exists right now. And you are so true in what you're saying, where it is just a slow, agonizing, self-loathing experience to have. Drug use also. And so I feel like when people hear about, you know, my sister's attempts, the automatic thing that I usually get is, you know, oh, was she just doing it for attention? And my answer to that is always yes and no. No, she wasn't doing it for attention in a way where she just wanted people to pay attention to her and, you know, give her praise, like, oh, thank you for being here. She wanted attention, and that she wanted to be seen, and she wanted to be validated. And with us and our lack of communication and our jarring throw into society, I feel like we just never got the skills or had the support to really to really kind of give meaning to what we were feeling. And so when she did go to college and she found these ways to kind of self-medicate, and, you know, her eating disorder got really, really, really bad, to a point where, you know, just seeing her in person was kind of shocking. What I always tell people is that was her way of trying to say something too. And it kind of, it hurts my feelings to say it lightly, because every day she came out of her room and said, hey, look at me, I'm sick, I need help. And people would just say, oh my gosh, you're so skinny, why are you doing that? You know, and it's what I'm saying is echoing what you were saying, where I feel like people need to kind of, and, you know, I say that kind of accusatory, but I wish there was more light shed on the ways that people try to communicate their depression and their low feelings.
Yeah, we've touched on eating disorders in the past. It's definitely a subject that I would like to shed more light on in the future, but to kind of give a more beneficial perspective, I would recommend listeners going to watch the movie To the Bone. It's Lily Collins and Keanu Reeves. It is now streaming on Netflix. Netflix does not sponsor or support us yet.
Hey, Netflix.
But yeah, no, so I've grown up a lot around women that struggled with those eating disorders, and dated some girls in high school that went through those, and it's it's so heartbreaking to kind of find the words to communicate with that person of their value and their worth.
Yep.
Because no matter how much positivity you speak into them, there's always that negative rebuttal that they have locked in the chamber and ready to go.
Yeah. And especially with borderline personality disorder, you know, it comes with so many feelings of self-loathing and shame and self-hatred. And, you know, when I was diagnosed, and I also want to say I in no way support the framework of just, you know, a black and white diagnosis. I don't want to say the word diagnosis and have people think like I'm just sitting in a jail cell of a diagnosis. It actually gave life to something that I had been feeling for so long, but it also allowed me to create a bridge between me and my sister in a way that we hadn't had before, and it was just really hard because she's not here to be on the other side of that bridge. But being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, it really allowed me to see that that was a big way that I was communicating with people, and sometimes having a diagnosis gives you the words that you didn't have before to be able to communicate with people that you're not doing well. And yeah, that was an experience that was very hard, but I'm still in a way kind of processing it.
Sure. And so Erin goes off to college, and it gets this culture shock of alcohol and drugs. And in her early 20s, she's actually diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And how did that diagnosis start to affect the family dynamic? Because I feel like in that, like, putting a name to it,
Yeah,
you now are forcing yourself to kind of walk away from your stigma and really start to embrace and consider how life is going to change now that you have a name for it.
yeah, it really makes you have to look at something, is how I tell people. It's like you finally, like, it became corporeal, you know, like the ghost is now a human, Casper is now a little boy, like we have a face to the name. And so yeah, there's again a lot of stigma with borderline personality disorder. I see it a lot in the mental health community, but especially back then, you know, like it was just one of those things where, you know, if you have borderline, you're a bad person. And if you have a child with borderline, you did something wrong. And if you have a sister with borderline, like, oh, you're fucked, you know, like that's kind of how we were all having to deal with those interpersonal relations. Again, my sister was diagnosed with bipolar for years, and as well was I. And it's pretty common because with borderline personality disorder, there has to be a history there to be able to say like, oh yeah, that was erratic, and oh, this is impulsive, and this is, you know, self-harming behavior, and we finally have a history of it. But once everything was kind of settled down, Erin really found a community, honestly, on LiveJournal. found a really large community of people who were also experiencing these same things. And again, I say social media sometimes can be such a great thing, because here were these people, these kids, honestly, who were struggling with mental health, whose parents didn't really know what they were doing or how to handle it or how to be supportive in a way that was needed and necessary. And they found this community, and I feel like that's what kept her going as long as she did. And what really kept her wanting to be alive is, at the end of her life, she wanted to be a counselor. She wanted to be a peer counselor, and she wanted to help people with borderline, because that community is just so important.
One of the things too that in preparation for this episode, you had shared the memorial video that you guys had played at her funeral, and she's very vocal
Mhm.
about mental health, and actually I'm really grateful because one of the things that, to pull the veil back from our own production behind the scenes thing, is that we're in the middle right now of kind of redoing our library of resources, and Erin actually had a very thorough, very in-depth library of her own resources that you had shared, and I'm excited to kind of bring those resources to our listeners and to readers. And it, I can definitely see the passion there that you talk about, her wanting to really invest into people that had the borderline personality disorder and kind of like break the stigma around it, because like you had said, like mental health, especially for borderline people, it has come a long way in the last 10 years, and there's a lot of things that I think a lot of people don't understand about it, and so they have this negative connotation already just from the sound of the diagnosis without actually getting to know the person. And so I just thought that it's very bold and very brave that she considered herself a person that was going to create that bridge, that was going to say it's okay not to be okay. Here's
Yes.
all of these resources, and let's talk about what it means to have borderline personality disorder.
Yeah, you're right. She was incredibly brave. She actually was a very notable voice in the mental health community. She had a few publications about it, and she was an incredible writer, very, very gifted writer. And that was her way of communicating her thoughts and feelings and educating other people. She had a blog that was, again, very notable in the community that a lot of people used for either resources, or they would ask her questions and she would respond. And so she really became like this beacon of, yes, it's okay to not be okay. We have borderline personality disorder. That does not make us bad people, and we're here to show you the types of people that we actually are.
Yeah, and I'm also wondering if we can back it up a little bit, because I I feel like I have gotten a little bit derailed just a little bit, and that's okay. But in one of the things that you had talked about in the video that you had shared that Erin talks about is the fact that she also had faced many overdoses.
Yep.
And that's a terrifying thing, to get a call saying your sister has overdosed.
Hmm.
And then to kind of come back to life, it makes you value that much that person a little bit richer. And what's it like to go through something like that, and how did that kind of affect your guys' relationship?
Well, there's a big dynamic around that. I feel like when she first attempted, it was with an overdose, and I wasn't really there emotionally. I don't think I was really taking it. Not that I wasn't taking it seriously, but I was kind of distancing myself in a way that was preparing myself to also be going through, if that makes sense. It's like I wanted to distance myself from seeing it, knowing that eventually I would be living it.
It,
Which sounds really like dark and morbid, but just trying to be real, like that.
well, no, not. I mean, I understand it, and because if you have your own history with substance abuse or self-infliction, then you really have to have your poo-poo together to really help someone else like that in need. And when it hits that close to home, it makes sense from your own mental health standpoint that you may want to separate yourself
Yeah,
from it at a distance,
yeah,
just for your own mental health.
and that is totally okay, to need that sometimes. But yeah, that's definitely definitely what I was doing. And also, you know, again, we weren't the best communicators. And I feel like I took it more as a rejection. Because at this point, my sister and I had not really gotten to bond. You know, we hadn't gotten there yet. We were kind of on bad terms. And you know, I selfishly took her attempt as a rejection, and I held that against her for much longer than was ever necessary. So we didn't really talk about it until later, but yeah, it was a struggle personally to watch her go through all of this, because a lot of her attempts varied in ways that she attempted, and that really showed me that, you know, she was really, really struggling, that, you know, it was never just one thing. And I've come to experience that more. I have a lot of really intrusive thoughts. And something that I was even just talking to my fiance Brandon about the other day is, you know, like, when I say I have negative suicidal thoughts, it's not just like a once, you know, in a blue moon because I see it on a TV show thing. It's like, it's pervasive. And my sisters were the same way. There are these pervasive negative thoughts saying that you shouldn't be here, you know, that you're not worth being here, that you're not worth the time. And later, as we got to become closer, you know, she really explained that to me honestly in a way that has made my life a lot better, because she really educated me before either of us even knew that I needed to be educated for my own sake.
And it's always crazy to me to think about how people that work in mental health, whether that is in a counselor format or a peer counselor or something like what we do with victims, that you are being educated and almost kind of groomed for a position in that field without even really knowing it. And it is experiences that you do have. And I look back at my own struggles throughout, you know, my teenage years in puberty and going through depression, and even now still having those days where I will have depression and I just need to be off of social media, or I need to talk to my wife, or I need to check in with our writing staff and see how their mental health is, and just making sure that, you know, a lot of the experiences that I've had in my own life have shaped me for the path that I'm on now. And I'm grateful for those experiences. And like you said, like, they're learning experiences, but you don't really necessarily know it in the moment that you're learning and experiencing education.
Yeah. I agree. But yeah.
So Erin was diagnosed with borderline in her early 20s, and she went and she was very active. You talked about her being a beacon and really trying to break down some of those barriers, stigma, and really trying to draw serious attention to the diagnosis. And at what point did these, you know, overdoses and these run in and outs of, you know, psychiatric hospitals and just suicide attempts, at what point did her mental health kind of decline for the worse, that it wasn't just attempts anymore, it was, I legitimately want to die?
I remember it exactly, actually. I was at work and I got a phone call from my mom that she had attempted, and she had overdosed on heart medication. So she was in a really, really bad spot. She actually was on life support. And that night, I went and saw my best friend, and we were just kind of talking, and he looked at me and he was like, Abby, like, what's going to happen if she dies? And that was the first time that I actually like took a moment and took a pause and was like, wow, it's getting a lot. It's getting to a point where it's could not come back. We thought we had lost her then. She was on life support for a little while and then came back around. But I was kind of at that point when I started preparing myself for her not being here anymore, which sounds really horrible. But again, like it's just kind of something I had to do, facing the facts of the situation, that she was not getting better, that she in fact was getting worse, that, you know, we had tried everything that we could try. She was doing everything that she could do. And yeah, that was kind of like the pinnacle moment for me.
So getting a call or a text saying that Erin had died from suicide.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I know for me, when I had gotten that text, I was at a loss for words, because mine kind of the friend of my friend Adam really blindsided me, and I was very ignorant in signs that I, you know, now a little bit more educated, but you had experienced so much, you know, the ins and outs of the like we talked about, like the psychiatric hospitals and the drug overdoses and the multiple suicide attempts. And so when the news finally came down that it was final, that the suicide had, you know, ended her life,
yeah,
for real, what was that like for you?
Well, so my parents, they were in Europe, and it was so horrible. It was everything. Of course, it's a horrible situation, but everything about it was just so horrible because my parents, you know, like they had worked their asses off for my sister's health, and they were incredible for her, and they finally allowed themselves to have a vacation. And so they planned it forever. They were so excited, you know, like they went to Europe and went on like the Sound of Music tour, like, 'cause we're just big fucking nerds, and like they were having an incredible time. And then that Facebook post happened, and my stomach dropped, you know, because it's like, not only are we having to deal with this, but my sister lived in Oregon, I was in Washington, and my parents were in Europe. You know, like what a horrible, horrible time to have to handle this. And I had a really bad feeling about it. You know, when I saw the Facebook post, and I tried to get in touch with her and I couldn't. And you know, I was just kind of told like, okay, we'll just go to bed. You know, I'm sure she'll be fine. And then I got a phone call at 2 a.m. from my dad that I initially ignored, because I feel like subconsciously, like I knew that was the call and I just didn't want to take it. And then he texted me, and I'll never forget what he texted me. He said, "Call me, Erin's dead." And so I jumped out of bed, and I was sitting there struggling to call my parents because, again, you know, fucking Europe. And I finally got in touch with him, and I was like, what happened? Like, and I remember even saying like, is she okay? Because I hadn't quite processed it. And then my dad said, no, Erin's dead, your sister's dead. And I just remember dropping to the floor and just screaming. And I had like in my head put myself through different scenarios, like what would happen if I found out this time? What would happen if I found out when I was here? What would happen if I found out when it was like this way that she had attempted? And nothing, like you said earlier, nothing can prepare you for that.
And I feel like, even maybe this is just me, or maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but I feel like being even in the setting of a memorial or a wake, preparing yourself for the funeral that is going to bury your loved one, it still doesn't feel real.
No.
And
No. I honestly, like, so I spoke at the memorial, and I remember like always kind of looking out of the corner of my eye, like, I kind of expected her to be there in a way. And there are still times when like I'll go to text her, or like, especially around Christmas time, I'll like see things in the store and be like, oh, Erin would really like that. I should get it for her for Christmas. And it's year 4, so it's just like anytime now I could stop, that'd be great.
And we're recording this on the 4th year anniversary of your sister's death, which happened to be December 12th, 2016. And it's so incredibly close to Christmas. And recently I just had a friend of mine who lost his father over Thanksgiving. And I was talking to a mutual friend, and just really, this year I feel like is really hard for people with holidays and families, because quarantine and COVID restrictions, and adding in all of this is the time of year where you're supposed to be with family, and adding in death, it just kind of makes that impact that much heavier. And so her death being so close to Christmas, what was that like?
Well, not only was it close to Christmas, but she was going to turn 32 and January 14th. And so, it was kind of one of those things where in the back of my head I was like, well, she could just make it. Like if she just make it to Christmas or make it to 32, then that would be different. But Christmas for us was already kind of hard and weird. Like again, like that crisis of faith kind of shook our family in terms of Christmas traditions. And my mom, her mom passed away around Christmas time. And so Christmas has always just been very difficult for us in general. And then having this happen, for years, I was so angry. I was so angry at Christmas. Which, how are you angry at Christmas, you might ask? Well, you just bitterly don't celebrate it and hate everyone who does. And I did that for 3 years. And this is the first Christmas. I'll just say openly, I'm actually in outpatient treatment right now because I had Christmas is not my best time, everyone. And so my counselor, who's amazing, shout out to my counselor, she was like, well, let's change this for you. Like, let's include her in Christmas, and then so you can have Christmas again. Like, stop punishing yourself, because that's what I was doing. And so this year, my fiance and I decided that this year and every year from now on, we're going to donate in her name to a foundation, an organization for mental health or suicide prevention, and then get an ornament for her, and a different ornament every year, and put it on the tree.
That's awesome. And the grieving process that comes after not just the loss of a loved one, but I think just leaving out the loss of a loved one, I know that I was really close to my grandmother growing up, and she died in the early 2000s, and she died October 27th, 2001. And I remember that, like, it was kind of almost like clockwork, where every year around that time, I just became like this like emotional wreck.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I met my wife that she was like, well, this isn't healthy for you to kind of like relive this, because you're almost borderline like torturing yourself. Like these like select days of the year, and you just have to kind of like learn to just, as bad as it is, like move on,
Yeah.
or find some way to move on. And it's really encouraging to hear you talk about the fact that you guys are doing that, and taking those steps necessary, because that part of that grieving process is allowing yourself to kind of return to peace and say, okay, well, they're in a better place now,
Yeah.
and they're not struggling anymore.
Yeah.
And I need to find solace in that, because my grief right now is, it's harming my own mental health.
Yeah.
And I need to take peace in the fact that she's no longer struggling.
Yeah. And that was really difficult for me to accept because, of course, like in my mind, it was like, well, why wasn't her better place with me? Like my sister should be with me. But I've now looking back and like growing a little more, um, I'm realizing that, it's her life wasn't about me. It was about her. And, it every year there was always that, that same pit in my stomach of like, oh, is this going to be the phone call? Is this going to be the year? Is this going to be the time? And no one should have to live like that with her, how she was living, like she struggled every day. Every day was a struggle for her. And she hung on for us. I'm really blessed and thankful that she gave me the knowledge that she did give me out of her experience. It's helped me both personally and professionally. And every day I just try to kind of, insert her in my life, and knowing that, being someone who also has borderline personality disorder, she would want me to be better. And that's kind of where I'm at with it right now.
And I feel like for my own story, one of the things that I'm always encouraged by is to bring my experience of surviving suicide to others.
Yeah.
Your story is heartbreaking and also equally inspirational, because you left behind this culinary career to pursue to make a difference in mental health, and to fight against legislations and stigma, and just a lot of the negative connotations that come with that career. And what advice would you give to someone right now that is either recently or just has gone through the surviving the death of someone who took their own life?
Well, it's interesting from my perspective as well, because I've also had two attempts. And so after my sister passed away, it really put things in perspective of, like it's weird in a way. I kind of feel like she left it to me, and it's the world changes so quickly, so fast, and I feel like it's the most important thing to take that person and give it back to the world in some way, and just kind of hope that that's how it works. I'm hoping that when I'm no longer here, that, someone takes this and they turn it forward. There's always going to be that grief, that emptiness it's always going to be there. But what I feel about grief is energy, and you can use that energy in a different direction and kind of use it as momentum. And so I really appreciate what you said about leaving behind the culinary career and going into mental health. It definitely is a challenge. It challenges me with my mental health, and what I can take. But I feel like I was not a complete person when my sister was here because of the things that she taught me when she wasn't here. And every day I feel like I grow more. And I guess I just challenge everyone to do that, is just grow as much as you can, because you don't know when you're going to be done growing.
I couldn't have said it any better myself. And every experience or every exchange that a person endures allows a chance for growth.
Mm-hmm.
And I look at, 2020, we all make the jokes about how terrible this year's been. But if you didn't grow this year, I think there might be something wrong. Because I look at a lot of this year and a lot of the changes that I've had to make, not only in my own life, but in my marriage and in friendships and just the way that I operate. And this year I went through a big period of depression because of the pandemic, and how that has shaped me and made me grateful for every day that I wake up now. And every chance that I get to get behind a mic, like it makes me that much more grateful for people, for not only people who listen to this and read our reviews, but also people like you that are willing to step up and share these stories and have these conversations.
Yeah, and I encourage people, if they are suicide loss survivors, if you go to the Suicide Prevention Lifeline website, they have an entire chapter just devoted to suicide loss survivors, how to take care of yourself, find support groups. They give you ways to ask for help when you're finding yourself at a loss for words. And the Suicide Prevention Lifeline is a really big part of my life, and I always encourage people to check it out, because either it can help you personally or you can learn something for someone else.
National Today is actually also a great resource as well. It's basically a day set aside where group of just people from all over the countries and chapters from and just different cities come together and talk about their experiences in being a suicide survivor. And so I also want to encourage people in that way as well. And I think that's going to conclude this episode of Victims and Villains. I'm always really grateful for these episodes. Not that I'm not grateful for the other episodes we do, but it takes a lot of bravery and a lot of vulnerability to do episodes and share experiences like this. So thank you so much, Abigail.
Of course. And I'm just going to give the number for the suicide hotline. It is 1-800-784-8433. And it's 24/7 and it's anonymous.
All right. We also have a plethora of resources in the show notes, as well as you guys heard earlier in our episode. So until next time, remember to keep. Let me back that up. But you guys can find those resources and more. And if you need someone to talk to, consider reaching out to us on our social medias. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Twitch, or Letterboxd, wherever you guys get your podcasts from. And go to victimsandvillains.net, where you guys can get in touch with us. Go get the suicide prevention resources, but also find episodes and reviews as well. So until next time, stay classy.
Bye, everyone.